Hello, welcome to week 3, Social Perception 2. I'm Aaron Mead and I'll be presenting a summary of the readings for us this week. Introduction. This week's reading focused on the second part of social perception. It expanded on the research and theories of self-comparison, perception, and attribution. The main focus in this part 2 is on racism, social categorization, and multiple social categorization, discontent, and self-identity. The two articles focus more on important issues in self-esteem and its connection with activism and the influence of music preference. All these theories, methods, and research look at the way individuals and groups interact with the world, more specifically with in-group, out-group, and intergroup dynamics. These are important topics to cover as racial tensions increase and there's more and more reference to us and them when it comes to political parties, immigration, and our world in general. There's more to all these topics, but we are focusing on these main ones in this paper. First, racism. It is important to understand what these different words mean so we can start to assess situations and decisions correctly. When we look at racism, there are many things that come into play. Racism is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's racial background or institutional and cultural practices that promote the domination of one racial group over another. Under racism, we find sexism, which is prejudice and discrimination based on a person's gender or institutional and cultural practices that promote the domination of one gender over another. Stereotype, which is belief or association that links a whole group of people with certain traits or characteristics. Prejudice, which is negative feelings towards persons based on their membership in certain groups. Discrimination is when behavior directed against persons because of their membership in a particular group. You can find that in the reading. These issues are major and come up in everyday life of people, some in major ways and some in not so major ways. Racism has many forms and some are more obvious than others. There are many people that without knowing use moral credibility to try and cover up some of their beliefs. Moral credibility is not being racist by demonstrating to others or even to themselves that they have good friends from the racial or ethnic group in question or they have behaved in ways that were quite fair to members in this group. The phrase, "I have African American friends," is used as a way to protect people from being accused of any racism, stereotypes, or prejudices. It is important when looking at these things to not only look at the surface, but look at some of the causes and the why behind it. That brings us to self-categorization. At the root of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination is the fact we divide our social world into groups. As perceivers, we routinely sort each other into groups on the basis of gender, race, age, and other common attributes in a process called social categorization. The level at which the self is defined determines how one relates to others, including members of the same groups. In so doing, the theory addresses self as well as other stereotyping and in-group and out-group stereotyping, and emphasizes that individuals ascribe themselves characteristics associated with their in-group. In-group and out-group association is helpful in some ways, but can be very detrimental in others. It is important to highlight some of the ways that intergroup connections are made that destroy racism. The book gave the example of sports. Ricky knew all about the contact hypothesis and was assured by a social scientist friend that a team could furnish the conditions needed for it to work. Equal status among teammates, personal interactions, dedication to a common goal, and a positive climate from the owner, managers, and coaches. As with the reference of Jackie Robinson in baseball. It is important for people to find more ways in which we can bring people together and finding common goals, although one of the main ways sports is together and finding common goals is one of the main ways and is a great tool. There was a YouTuber that broke racism around sports. On the day of the Super Bowl, he met some men that happened to be homeless and asked them if they wanted to attend the Super Bowl party he was putting on. They agreed, and for the whole day they celebrated together and got to hear one another's stories. It is through actions like this that we will see racism lower in this country. Next, we have social categorization. Answer the question, who am I, has fueled the research for many years. It is important to understand the reasons that go into people's decisions and how they see themselves. In-groups and out-groups are a big part of figuring out the answer to who and where do I belong. In-groups are with which an individual feels a sense of membership, belonging, and identity. Out-groups are groups with which an individual does not feel a sense of membership, belonging, or identity. When a person is working with this question of who they are, where they belong, researchers have looked at the basis for why people make decisions. When people are faced with hard choices or opposing views, they typically double down on the involvement and beliefs of their own in-group. This is called identity fusion, to describe the sense of oneness that people may feel with a group. This feeling can motivate helpful behavior toward the group, even at the risk of a personal sacrifice. In general, when we are feeling threatened or uncertain, we become especially motivated to reaffirm our identification and closeness with an in-group, which can make us feel more safe and secure. This is seen a lot when people interact on social media. When on social media, people are exposed to a different point of view or a contrasting opinion, it's easy to see them associate more and find more resources to back up their original opinion rather than investigate the opinion of the out-group. When faced with social categorization, we are going to further explore the two broad classes of theory and research: self-categorization theory and social cognition. Self-categorization theory says that anytime individuals can be categorized in terms of personal me versus not me, or social us versus them identities. Personal identities are established by differentiating the self or others in terms of shared higher order identities. Focus on the ways that individuals are unique from one another. Social identities, in contrast, are defined by group memberships and focus on how individuals simultaneously similar to like others in group and different from unlike others out group. In other words, people can boost their self-esteem through their own personal achievements or through affiliation with successful groups. Next is multiple social categorization. Important research is coming out about how people process information, especially when creating a category for someone to fit in. Theory has now been developed and is called theories of situated cognition, which expand on the notion that categorization, rather than being a fixed and rigid process, is contextually and motivationally sensitive. The theories have been developed by Smith and Siemens research and are broken down into three principles for the conceptualization of categorization. They can be broken down to three main influences: context, environment, and perceptions. There's less rigidity in the way people process categorization than previously thought. In 2019, the world is smaller now and more connected than ever. Living in Chicago, there is a statement being used by many organizations which is summarized by saying, no longer do people have to travel to meet others from around the world. The world is coming to Chicago. This is a further example of how multiple categorization, social categorization, is a big part of how society interacts with one another and begins to build bridges. Biculturalism is an example of the way that people are no longer one-dimensional. Biculturalism is when individuals are influenced by two or more cultures at the same time compared to associating fully with one. Biculturalism will lead to integrate complexity. This can be really difficult as cultures collide within the same person. They have to identify that. There's a missionary school in Kenya that is mostly full of American students. It is a boarding school where students board for 9 months of the year and join their parents for the remaining 3. Individual in this situation would have a lot of internal conflict and complex integration because they are living in Kenya's culture while bringing in their own American culture. Then for 3 months of the year, they are living in a totally different culture, as most missionary families live outside of Kenya. With this bicultural lens, stereotypes take on a whole new meaning, are less judgmental because they have met someone or understand a different culture. Exposure to images and individuals that reflect the diversity within social groups, for example, can help weaken stereotypes and combat their automatic activation. Discontent. Throughout life, we believe that certain things are owed to us. There are certain things people should not be without: Homelessness isn't something that makes sense because for people, there's a level of necessary things that every person should have. According to relative deprivation theory, deprivation is experienced relative to a shared standard as opposed to being determined by some absolute measure of deprivation. There are many theories that talk about discontent, such as frustration aggression theory, justice theory, theory of hedonic relativism, and then there are many social comparison theories. One of those social comparison theories is Adams' equity theory. Central to the theory is the idea that social exchange can be judged by the participants to be fair or unfair. One of the dangers of discontent is that it can break up groups, and instead of creating intergroup exchanges, now is focused once again on us and them, what is called realistic conflict theory. Realistic conflict theory is the view that direct competition for valuable but limited resources breeds hostility between groups. This reminds me of the movie Pocahontas, when John Smith and Pocahontas are talking about the tall buildings and cities that they're going to build there in the new land. And she looks at him and says, "What is wrong with ours?" And his response to her is that you don't know any better. Self-identity theory is the final topic that we're going to look at. Self-identity theory is the theory that people favor in-groups over out-groups in order to enhance their self-esteem. There's a lot of people in this world, and it is in everyone to feel like they are special or they are somewhat important. People will identify with certain in-groups that become part of who they are. They boost their involvement and investment into those groups so that the positive outcomes of self-esteem can continue. The theory has been tested in many different situations. In the article that looked at self-esteem music preference, there was an expected outcome of connection, but the results were not there. Overall, the results provide both support and challenges for social identity theory. In summary, previous research had failed to convincingly uncover a relationship between music preference and self-esteem. There seems like there should be a connection between self-esteem and music preference, as there are generations where certain bands were iconic and people developed their identity around those groups. Yet, it is yet to be seen in research. Another interesting piece of self-identity theory is intergroup connections. What seems to motivate much in-group bias and intergroup discrimination is a treatment of in-group members and not necessarily hostility towards out-group members. Sometimes this is where a church member can get caught. There isn't any real out-group discrimination, but it can seem to people that a Christian only cares about those that are inside the building. This is a hard thing to balance because the church is meant to care for those in the body, and it's easier when that trust is built in. For example, it's easier for a person to give money to support a fellow church member than support a person asking for money on a street corner. Finally, in conclusion, as we have covered some of this week's reading, we are looking at how people interact with themselves and the world around them. Our associations with certain groups impact how the world works. There's great research happening to help people navigate why they make the decisions they make. Yet one of the most surprising environments when it comes to the topic of in-group and out-group associations is that churches can struggle the most. The church in America is one of the most segregated places that we have in our communities. The Bible talks about heaven as being a collection of all people groups and from all nations. All people will benefit from learning about these topics from this week's reading, but I believe that church has the most to learn. So I pose these two questions to the group. First, what does the Bible say about interacting with people when it comes to racism, sexism, or other prejudice and stereotypes? Second, how much or how little do prejudices, racism, or sexism get passed down from generation to generation? Thank you.